Back in the fall of 2016, I worked for the Forest Service in Wyoming. I was 34 at the time and had been with them for close to 8 years. My job wasn't glamorous. Most days were filled with basic trail maintenance, radio check-ins, weather reports, and hauling gear in and out of zones people rarely stepped foot in. I wasn't a social person, and I preferred those quiet posts. So when they asked me to stay up at one of the remote ranger cabins deep in the Medicine Bow National Forest for about 2 weeks to help monitor fire risk and check on some camera traps, I said yes without a second thought. The place was called South Elk Creek Cabin, but most folks on the team just called it Unit 12 or South Cabin. It sat about 11 miles from the nearest drivable road. You either hiked in or used the ATV, but the trail was so narrow and overgrown in parts that I usually just walked it. I took my pack, my gear, and a .45 revolver I carried more out of habit than need. I'd been alone in the backcountry plenty of times. Nothing ever happened. Not anything serious, at least. This cabin wasn't anything special. A basic wooden structure, maybe 25 feet long, with a small loft upstairs for sleeping, a propane stove, a work table, and a busted radio that only worked when it felt like it. No electricity.
No plumbing.
Water came from the creek about 70 yards downhill. Most of the windows were just glass panes with nailed-down wooden shutters. Only one of them opened, and that one faced the hill slope behind the cabin. I swept the place out, checked the stock of propane tanks, logged my arrival, and settled in. The first few days were nothing. I hiked the nearby game trails, swapped SD cards on camera traps, kept an eye out for smoke columns, and took weather readings every morning and evening. There were signs of bears in the area, scat and claw marks on some trees, but nothing too fresh. No human activity either, which was how I liked it. But on the fourth night, I heard something odd. It started as a dragging sound on the cabin wall. Just a scrape, slow, like someone running a piece of metal or a stick along the outside. I sat up in the loft and waited, holding my breath. It was just after midnight. No wind.
No rain.
Cold but still. The sound stopped after maybe 30 seconds. I climbed down and checked through the window, but the moon wasn't bright enough to see anything. My flashlight beam didn't catch anything out of the ordinary. I figured it could have been a porcupine or maybe a mountain lion rubbing against the cabin. It wasn't uncommon. Still, I didn't like it. The next morning, I found long drag marks in the dirt circling the cabin. Not deep, but visible. Wide grooves like something heavy had been pulled across the ground. They made a full loop and then veered off toward the tree line. I followed them for a bit, maybe 30 yards, but they just faded away near the edge of a rocky patch.
No footprints.
Nothing else. It gave me a weird feeling, but I wrote it off. Maybe a bear had pulled some dead tree branches around. Maybe a small landslide pushed debris. I noted it in my log and went on with my day. 2 days later, I found the shed door open. There was a small supply shed about 15 feet from the cabin. We stored extra tools, rope, gas cans, and backup gear there. The latch was a heavy-duty hook, and the kind that needs force to open. I know I latched it. I checked all my locks every night, especially after that scraping noise. But that morning, the door was wide open. Nothing seemed to be missing, though a small hatchet was lying in the grass a few feet away. It looked like it had just been dropped. That's when I started getting cautious. I checked the perimeter more thoroughly. Looked for footprints. Nothing. The ground was dry, hard-packed dirt and pine needles. If someone had come around, they would have needed to be damn careful. We're lucky. Still, it rattled me. That night, I barely slept. I laid on the mattress in the loft with the revolver beside me, listening. At some point after 2 in the morning, I heard something move behind the cabin. A crunch, then a thud, then silence. I didn't move. I just stared at the roof beams and waited for something else. I never heard it walk away. That's what got to me. In the morning, I found claw marks on the back wall. Deep ones. Not the shallow kind bears leave when they're just rubbing or scratching. These were in a downward arc. 3 long lines, maybe 2 feet long. I touched them, fresh. The wood around them had little splinters curling out. I measured the spacing with my fingers. Too narrow for a black bear. Maybe a bobcat or mountain lion. But those don't typically claw buildings unless cornered. And definitely not quietly. I hiked out that afternoon. 11 miles in just under 3 hours. No radio signal. No cell service. I reached the ranger station at Elk Fork around 5 in the evening and filed a report. The lead ranger, Greg, asked if I wanted to be rotated out, but I said no. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was making too much of it. I agreed to hike back in the next day. When I returned, the cabin door was open. The latch was busted clean off. The screws were bent outward, like someone had pried the door open from the outside. Inside, it looked like someone had rummaged through my things. My bag was open. My gear was scattered. The propane stove had been moved, just a few inches, but enough to notice. There were boot prints near the door, but only a few. And they were weird, not a full tread. Just the front half, like someone was walking on their toes or only putting partial weight down. I checked the shed. That same hatchet was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the cabin with the revolver in my lap and a flashlight gripped in my left hand. The air felt tight, like something was close, just waiting. I kept hearing sounds out there. Not animals, not wind, just movement, steady steps, the faint crack of branches, breathing even, like short puffs on the other side of the wall. I never saw anyone, but I knew someone was out there. The next morning, I found a rope nailed to a tree. It was maybe 40 feet from the cabin. A thick rope, ours, wrapped and knotted, hanging loosely with the frayed end dangling like a noose. I hadn't put it there. I don't know who had. It wasn't part of any training or emergency marker. Just there, hung up like it meant something. That day, I made the rounds, checked the cameras. On the third SD card from a tree-mounted camera on Trail B, I found something. The timestamp said it was from 3 nights ago. The photo showed a man standing behind the cabin.
No uniform. No gear.
Just jeans, a dark hoodie, and a white plastic bag in one hand. The next photo, taken 10 seconds later, showed him walking toward the wall. Then nothing. No face shots. No sign of where he went. Just those 2 frames. I didn't bother sleeping after that. That night it rained. Hard. The kind of cold mountain rain that soaks through everything and makes the forest echo. Around 1 a.m., I saw someone standing near the tree line. Just a silhouette. He stood still for a long time. I turned off the lantern and crouched by the window. He didn't move, didn't call out, didn't step closer, just watched. I stayed there until sunrise. When I finally got the courage to step out, he was gone. But his tracks were in the mud, deep ones. He'd been barefoot. That morning, I packed everything. My clothes, the gear, the weather logs. I didn't report anything on the radio. I just left a note in the logbook. Asterisk leaving early due to weather and cabin damage. Will debrief at Elk Fork Station. Asterisk then I started the 11-mile hike out. At mile 4, I saw movement behind me. I didn't turn around at first, just kept walking. Then I saw it again. Something dark weaving through the trees. I stopped, listened, stopped too. I waited a full minute before I started moving again. 2 miles later, I smelled smoke. A thick, wet, bitter smell. I turned around. A thin column of gray was rising back in the direction of the cabin. My guess? Someone set it on fire. Or maybe just lit a pile of wet leaves to mess with me. I didn't go back to find out. When I reached the station, I gave them a full report. I showed the photos, described everything. They sent out 2 guys the next day. They found the cabin door broken, the rope and tracks. but the rain had washed most of it away. The SD cards were gone. The cameras too. I never found out who that man was.
No suspects. No arrests.
No missing persons matched the description. Some folks at the station said maybe it was a local squatter or a hermit, but that didn't sit right with me. Whoever it was, they weren't just living out there. They were watching, waiting, testing, seeing how close they could get before I'd leave. And they won. I never went back to that cabin. Never wanted to. A few months later, the Forest Service closed it down and relocated the monitoring station to a different zone. I still do backcountry work, still stay in ranger cabins sometimes, but now I bring extra locks. I set trip lines, and I don't stay more than 2 nights in the same spot, because out there, in those miles of quiet woods, there are people you'll never see, people who don't want to be found, people who learn your habits, study your patterns, and wait just long enough to see if you'll break. I did, and I don't think I was the first. It was late October 2011, and the kind of cold that settled into your bones was already in the air up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I was 32 back then, and still trying to keep up the old traditions I used to share with my dad before he passed. He used to take me up north every fall for deer hunting season, and even though he'd been gone 5 years by then, I still went. There was something about being alone out there in the woods, the thick smell of pine and the frozen leaves underfoot, that made me feel close to him, almost like he wasn't completely gone. The cabin wasn't anything special. A small one-room box of rough-cut lumber my dad had built back in the 80s with help from some buddies. No electricity, no running water, just a cast iron wood stove, a bunk bed, and an outhouse about 20 feet out behind the trees. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about 4 miles off a dirt road you'd miss if you didn't know where to look. Most folks didn't even know it was there. That was the point. I hadn't been up there since the previous season, and even that had been cut short when I got a stomach bug and had to pack it in early. This year, I was determined to stay the full week. I loaded up my old Chevy Blazer with gear, a cooler of food, my rifle, some extra propane for the little heater I brought with me sometimes, and hit the road just before sunrise. It was a long drive, just over 8 hours, but I made good time. I passed through Marquette before heading off the main road and onto the smaller county roads that led into the forest. By the time I parked at the old overgrown logging trail, the sun was dipping low and casting long shadows through the trees. I grabbed my pack and rifle, locked the Blazer, and started hiking the 4 miles in. I knew the trail by heart. Every twist, every fallen tree, every rock. I'd been walking it since I was 10 years old. When I reached the cabin, it was just how I remembered it. A bit more weathered, maybe with a couple shingles loose on the roof and moss crawling higher up the back wall. I pushed open the old creaking door and stepped inside. Dust coated everything. A few old wasp nests hung from the rafters, and the mouse traps I'd left last year had caught 2 unlucky victims, long dried and stiff. I got to work cleaning, sweeping out the dust and tossing the dead mice out into the woods. I got the wood stove going and warmed the place up while I unpacked. Outside, the last bit of light was disappearing fast. The forest was already dark, like it always got up there, with just that pale blue hue left in the sky. The kind that makes all the trees look like tall black shapes, like shadows of giants. That first night was uneventful. I cooked up some soup on the little propane stove, read a bit from a hunting magazine I found buried under my cot, and turned in early. The forest was alive with sound that night. I heard owls, something rooting through the brush nearby, and what sounded like coyotes far off. Normal things I'd heard 100 times before. But the second night was different. I'd spent the day scouting and found some fresh tracks not far from the old deer stand me and my dad had put up years ago. Looked like a decent buck had come through, maybe even bedding down a ways off. I marked the spot and planned to go out before first light the next morning. I got back to the cabin late, tired and sore, and cooked up some beans and rice. That night, around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The cabin was dead quiet. No wind, no forest sounds. That was what struck me first, how still it was. I sat up on the bunk, listening. I didn't hear anything for a good 30 seconds. Then I heard a faint crunch of leaves from behind the cabin. It was slow, not like an animal darting around, but something heavier, deliberate. One step, then another, then nothing. I waited, heart starting to thump in my chest. Then it came again. Crunch, crunch. Now, I'm not the kind of guy to jump to conclusions, but I'd been hunting and camping long enough to know how to read movement. This wasn't a raccoon or deer. It wasn't four-legged. It was upright, 2 feet. I grabbed my rifle, stepped out of the bunk, and moved slowly to the window. There was no light, but my eyes were adjusted enough to see shadows. I saw nothing out there, just trees and darkness. The sound stopped for a while, and I waited for almost 10 minutes, just standing there, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like someone stepping around the side of the cabin, crunching through leaves slowly, trying not to make noise. But I could hear them, just enough. I didn't want to fire unless I had to. The last thing I wanted was to kill some dumb drunk who wandered into the wrong patch of woods. So I stepped outside onto the porch with the rifle lowered, holding my breath. Nothing, just cold air and darkness. I stood out there a while longer, scanning the tree line. Eventually, I went back inside and stayed awake until the first light broke through the trees. I told myself maybe it was a black bear. Maybe I imagined how it moved. I didn't go hunting that day. Instead, I walked a few hundred yards out in every direction around the cabin. I found footprints, human, clear as day. They circled around the back of the cabin, veered off toward the old well, then vanished into the woods. They weren't mine. I hadn't been over there since I arrived. No tire tracks, no signs of another vehicle, just prints. That night, I made sure the rifle was loaded. I set up a few small noise traps, empty cans tied to fishing line across some of the narrow trails leading toward the cabin. Something I picked up from an old trapper I'd met years ago. Then I waited. It was just after 1 a.m. when I heard the first can rattle. It was faint but sharp. I bolted up in bed and grabbed the rifle. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard slow footsteps again, right outside. I crept to the door and peeked through the crack. Nothing in front. Then I heard it again, this time toward the back wall. I moved toward the window over the counter and looked out. This time I saw something. A figure. Not close, but maybe 30 feet back, standing between the trees. They weren't moving, just standing still. I couldn't make out their face, but I could see the outline of a person. Not wearing orange, not carrying a rifle. Just standing there, looking at the cabin. I raised the rifle and pointed it toward them, but they didn't move. I blinked, and when I looked again, they were gone. I stepped outside again, heart in my throat, scanning the trees. I didn't go far. I wasn't going to chase someone into those woods in the dark. I barely slept that night. When morning came, I found more prints. This time, they came from the north, circled the cabin twice, and disappeared back into the trees. I followed them a little ways. They were deep, spaced evenly, like someone walking carefully. But the weirdest part was the cigarette butts I found. 4 of them still fresh, tossed in a pile not far from a tree stump about 50 yards from the cabin. Someone had been sitting there, watching. I didn't want to stay another night, but I didn't want to leave either. That cabin was mine, my dad's. I felt like leaving meant giving it up. So I told myself I'd give it one more night. One more, then I'd head out. I didn't make it through that night. It was around 11 o'clock when I heard the first sound. Not footsteps this time, It was a knock. 3 slow, hard knocks on the back wall. Not the door, the back wall of the cabin. I froze. Another knock. Same spot. Then silence. I raised my rifle and stood near the stove, aiming at the back wall. I didn't say anything, just waited. Then I heard something drag across the wall outside, like someone running a stick along the boards. I moved toward the window and looked out. Nothing, but I could feel it. Someone was out there. That's when the cans rattled. Loudly. Then another set rattled a second later. 2 different sides of the cabin. I realized what was happening. They weren't alone. Whoever was out there, there was more than one. That was it. I wasn't staying. I threw my gear into my pack as fast as I could. Didn't bother folding anything. Just shoved it in. I kept the rifle in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I didn't even turn the flashlight on right away. I didn't want to give away where I was going. I left the cabin and started hiking down the trail back toward the blazer. I knew I had about a 45-minute walk if I moved fast. I didn't stop. I kept listening, hearing things behind me. Sticks snapping, soft steps in the brush. I didn't dare turn around. I reached the blazer and threw the gear inside, started the engine, and turned the high beams on. For just a second, as I pulled away, I saw someone step out of the trees and look at me. Just for a second. I didn't go back. Later, I filed a report with the DNR and the local sheriff's office. They said they'd check it out, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Just woods and shadows. Maybe some old prints if the rain hadn't washed them away. I sold the cabin the next year. Cheap. Told the guy it was too far out for me now. Too much work keeping it up. I didn't tell him about the people in the woods, the cigarette butts, the watching. Sometimes I still think about it. What they wanted. If they were just messing with me. Or if they were waiting for something. For me to fall asleep. For me to step outside. I never go into the woods alone anymore. And I never will again. I had been needing a break from everything for a long time. After years working construction in Denver, long hours, noisy job sites, constant rush to meet deadlines, I finally burned out. My boss gave me a month off when I snapped at a client. I didn't argue. I knew I needed to reset. A friend of mine told me about a place he used to go as a kid, deep in the Colorado mountains, far from the cities. A family cabin no one really used anymore. Said it wasn't pretty, but it was free and surrounded by wilderness. I didn't even think twice. I packed up some canned food, clothes, ammo, and camping gear and drove up into the mountains with my dog, a big German Shepherd mix named Bear. I wanted silence, space, and cold air. I wanted to get away from phones, people, noise. I just didn't expect what came after. The cabin was on the western slope, maybe 45 minutes off a small 2-lane road, and another 2 hours of winding dirt tracks that barely counted as roads. The place sat in a wide clearing surrounded by thick trees that stretched in every direction. Pine, spruce, deadfall everywhere. It was isolated, and I mean isolated. No cell signal, no nearby houses, no power lines. Just a small cabin with a metal roof, a rusted old wood stove, and 2 dusty rooms with sagging furniture. The first few days were perfect. I spent my time hiking, chopping wood, reading old books I brought, and just laying out on the back porch listening to nothing. Bear loved it out there. He'd run around chasing squirrels or deer, sniffing at trees, barking at nothing. He'd come back muddy and panting, tongue hanging out like a kid on summer break. By the 5th night, I noticed something strange. It wasn't anything major, just a weird feeling, like I was being watched. I shrugged it off. I knew being alone in the woods could mess with your head. You hear twigs snap, wind howl, and suddenly it feels like something's out there. I tried not to think about it. That night, Bear wouldn't settle. Normally, he'd curl up on the mat by the stove and sleep like a rock. But he kept getting up, walking to the door, ears forward, body stiff. I looked outside with a flashlight a few times but saw nothing, just trees and darkness. I figured maybe a raccoon or coyote was sniffing around. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. Nothing unusual. No prints, no scat, no broken branches. But Bear kept acting off. He wouldn't wander far from the cabin. He'd just sit on the porch, growling low at the woods. I told myself maybe a bear had passed through the area during the night, or a mountain lion. That was enough to make a dog uneasy. I stayed sharp after that. I started keeping my .30-06 rifle loaded and leaning against the cabin wall. I also started noticing the woods were getting quieter during the day. The birds weren't chirping as much. No squirrels chattering in the trees. Just a kind of stillness that didn't feel normal. Like something had passed through and scared everything away. On the 8th night, something woke me up. It was Bear. He was standing by the window, hackles raised, growling deep in his chest. The growl wasn't playful or defensive. It was a warning. I grabbed my rifle and stood up, heart pounding. I walked to the window, moved the curtain a bit, and looked out. First, I didn't see anything. The trees swayed in the wind, moonlight casting silver lines across the yard. Then I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the tree line. It was far away, maybe 50 yards. I couldn't make out details, but it looked like a person. A tall figure, very still, facing the cabin. I stared hard, thinking maybe it was just a tree stump or a shadow. But then it moved. Not fast. Just a small shift, like it turned its head slightly. Then it stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed up all night with the rifle across my lap. Bear didn't lie down either. He sat next to me, eyes locked on the window, ears twitching every time the wind moved. In the morning, I walked out to where I saw it. I found nothing. No prints, no broken branches. Just snow-melted ground and pine needles. The ground was soft enough that I should have seen something if someone was walking out there. I thought maybe it was a hiker who got turned around. But something about it didn't sit right. Nobody would be out here this deep without a car, without lights, without gear. And nobody would just stand in the woods staring at a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night. That day, I loaded everything I could into the truck. I kept the essentials unpacked but ready, just in case I needed to leave fast. But I didn't go yet. Something in me wanted to wait. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to be that guy who runs because of some shadows. But a bigger part of me wanted answers. The next night, I set up camp inside the cabin like normal, but I didn't sleep. I kept the lights off, just sat there with Bear and the rifle staring out the windows. At around midnight, I saw it again. This time, it was closer, maybe 30 yards. Again, just standing still at the edge of the trees. It looked taller than before. Lean, long arms. No light.
No gear.
Just a person-shaped figure in the dark. Then it crouched. I froze. Crouched down low like it was trying to disappear into the brush. And it stayed like that for a long time. I watched it through a crack in the curtain. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After maybe 10 minutes, it turned and slipped back into the trees. I stayed up again, watched the window until the sun came up. Bear didn't sleep either. His eyes were glassy, tired, but locked on that same patch of woods. The following morning, I found something new. Footprints. Bare feet. Long, narrow prints, no shoes. Toes visible in the dirt and snow patches. They led from the woods to a tree about 20 yards from the cabin, then disappeared. That's when I stopped messing around. I packed everything for real. I was going to leave. I didn't care about finishing my month off. Something was out here and it was watching me, but the truck wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I checked the hood. Wires were chewed or cut. I don't know how. I didn't hear anything. Bear didn't bark. It looked too clean to be an animal. No mess, no other damage. That day, I hiked out 3 miles to try and get a signal.
No lag.
The mountain blocked most of it. I tried climbing a nearby ridge but didn't get anything solid. Just one bar that dropped every time I opened the map app. I marked the direction for the next attempt. It was clear I needed to get out on foot. That night was the worst. I set up inside with all the windows covered. Lights off. Bear stayed glued to me. I had my backpack ready, boots on, rifle across my knees. Then I heard it. A scratching sound on the side of the cabin. Not claws, not an animal. Like fingers. It circled the cabin slowly. Then silence. Then a knock. A single knock on the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there staring at the wood like it might explode open. Then footsteps. Slow. Circling. Crunching in the gravel and dry leaves. Then nothing. I stayed that way until dawn. When light finally crept through the cracks in the wood slats, I grabbed my pack, my rifle called Bear, and we left. I locked the cabin out of habit, even though it felt pointless. We hiked 12 miles that day. Found a ranger outpost. Empty, but it had a radio. I called in a distress and got a response 2 hours later. A crew picked us up just before sunset. When I got back to town, I reported everything. Sheriff took notes. Told me probably a squatter or some backwoods survivalist. But he didn't say it with much confidence. Especially when I showed him the photos of the footprints I'd taken. A few weeks later, I got a call. They checked the cabin. Found more footprints. More signs someone had been circling the place for days. But no fingerprints.
No traceable prints.
They said someone had been watching me, maybe living in the woods nearby. Never caught them. A month later, I sold the truck. I didn't go back to the cabin. I don't even talk to that friend anymore who told me about it. I don't blame him. He didn't know. But something was up there, watching me. Something that knew how to move quietly, stay hidden, and get inside your head. I don't know what it was. Some people joked and said skinwalker, but I don't believe in that stuff. I just know it wasn't right. It wasn't natural. It was a person or something close enough, and that's somehow worse. I still think about it sometimes. About the shape in the woods, the bare feet, the knock on the door. Sometimes I dream about it. Not the face. I never saw a face. Just the shape, the crouch, the way it watched and waited. Whatever it was, I know one thing for sure. It wanted me out of there. And I listened. My name is Mark Whitaker. I'm 35 now, but this happened in the fall of 2014 when I was 24 years old. Back then, I was living in a small town in Idaho called Wallace. It's an old mining town tucked between hills and valleys. Quiet most of the year except when tourists come through. I wasn't doing much with my life at the time, working night shifts at a convenience store, wasting my days sleeping or messing around online. I didn't really have many friends, and I wasn't close with my family. Life just felt stuck. One October morning, I decided I needed to get away for a bit. I'd been feeling anxious for weeks for no clear reason. I figured a short solo trip up into the woods might help. No phone, no internet, just trees and quiet. So I asked around about any old trails or cabins in the woods nearby. An older guy named Eddie, who used to work as a logger, told me about a place halfway up Rattlesnake Ridge, an old hunting cabin that had been abandoned for decades. He said nobody used it anymore, but it was still standing last he saw it. He even gave me rough directions, drawn with a pen on the back of a soda box. It sounded perfect. I packed light sleeping bags, some canned food, water, a small hatchet, flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and my old .22 rifle, just in case I ran into any wildlife. I filled up my old Toyota Tacoma and started driving out early that Saturday morning. The road up Rattlesnake Ridge wasn't marked. I had to turn off the main gravel road and take a barely there dirt trail. The trees got thicker the higher I went. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. After about 2 hours of slow climbing in low gear, I parked the truck under some pines where the trail became too narrow to drive. I followed the directions Eddie gave me, hiking another hour through thick brush and uneven terrain until I found it. The cabin was there just like he said. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine and fir trees. The roof was sagging in the middle. Some of the logs had moss growing between the cracks, and one of the windows had a broken pane covered with an old board. But it was still standing. The front door hung slightly crooked on rusted hinges, but I pushed it open with a creak and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood, dirt, and something else, maybe mildew. The place was small. One main room with a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and a small cot tucked into the corner. A shelf hung loosely from one wall, and on it sat a rusty tin cup, a hunting knife, and an old lantern that didn't work anymore. The dust was thick on everything. There were no signs anyone had been here in a long time. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, lit a candle, and started unpacking. The first day was quiet. I hiked around the area, took some photos, and even found the remains of what looked like an animal trap set deep in the brush, long rusted shut. That night, I sat near the fireplace and heated up a can of chili over a small camp stove I brought. I kept the door closed and blocked the bottom with my pack to keep out the cold drafts. The wind was loud up here, whipping through the trees like distant howling. Still, I slept fine. The second day is when things started feeling off. I woke up early, around 6 a.m. The air was freezing, and my breath came out in little clouds. I stepped outside to relieve myself and immediately noticed something strange. The pine needles around the front of the cabin had been disturbed. They weren't like that the day before. Something or someone had walked around in front of the cabin. The prints were light, not deep enough for a bear or elk. Could have been a coyote or a mountain lion, but I didn't see any claw marks. Just shallow indents, almost like someone walking in soft-soled shoes. That made me uneasy. Still, I tried not to overthink it. It's the woods. Animals come and go. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I spent the rest of the day chopping some dry branches nearby to use as firewood and exploring more of the surrounding forest. Around midday, I found what looked like an old deer stand about half a mile from the cabin. Just a few planks nailed between trees, rotted and collapsing. But then I found something else. A length of rusted barbed wire stretched low across the forest floor, about knee height. It didn't look like it belonged to any fence. It was just there, stretched between 2 trees, almost like a trip wire. That made my stomach knot. I backed away from it slowly, keeping my ears open. The forest felt too quiet.
No birds, no squirrels.
Just stillness. I made my way back to the cabin quicker than before. That night, I loaded the rifle and kept it beside me while I ate. I didn't want to scare myself too much, but I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Something wasn't right out here. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. Every creak of the old cabin made my heart pound. At one point, around 2:30 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps crunching leaves outside. Slow ones. I held my breath and sat up, gripping the rifle tight. The sound lasted maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I didn't sleep after that. When morning came, I stepped outside to check again. Fresh prints. This time they were clearer.
Definitely boot prints.
Not mine. I wear size 11 hiking boots. These were smaller. The treads were different too, flatter, almost like work boots. They came from the trees and stopped a few feet in front of the door, then turned around and disappeared into the woods again. I couldn't explain that away. There was no reason anyone should be up here. It was remote. No trails, no roads, no signs of recent activity. I thought about leaving right then, but I convinced myself it was just some hunter passing through. Maybe they saw my truck and got curious. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Still, I stayed. One more night. I don't even know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. I spent the day close to the cabin, never letting it out of my sight. I didn't explore. I didn't hike. I just kept circling it, watching the trees. Every hour, I checked the area for new tracks, but nothing changed. At nightfall, I locked the door with a makeshift wedge using one of the chairs. I barely touched my food. I sat with my back against the wall, facing the door, rifle on my lap. Around midnight, it started to rain, a slow drizzle tapping against the roof. The wind picked up again. Then around 3 a.m. I heard it. Not footsteps this time. Something tapped against the wall of the cabin. Just once. Then a pause. Then again. Slow. Deliberate. Not the wind. I held my breath. Then came another sound, this one closer to the front, like someone dragging something across the wood outside. Then nothing. I sat like that until the sun started to rise. When it got light enough, I opened the door with the rifle aimed ahead. Nothing. But to the left of the cabin, I found something new. A dead rabbit, hanging from a low tree branch by its hind legs. Its throat slit. It was fresh. Blood had dripped onto the leaves below. That wasn't an accident. That was a message. That was the final straw. I grabbed my gear, packed as fast as I could, and left. I didn't eat. I didn't check anything twice. I hiked the entire way back to my truck without stopping, heart hammering the whole time. Every crack of a branch behind me made me spin around, but I never saw anyone. Not once. When I finally reached the truck and turned the key, I half expected it not to start. But it did. I didn't waste a second getting the hell out of there. I never told anyone the full story. Just said I saw signs of a bear and decided to come back early. I never went back to that ridge. A few months later, I ran into Eddie again and asked him more about the cabin. He just shrugged and said it had always been strange up there. Some hunters had stopped using it after finding weird stuff in the woods. He didn't ask me what I saw. Years have passed and I still think about it. I've stayed in a lot of remote places since then. Deserts, forests, abandoned mines, but nothing ever felt like that cabin. It wasn't haunted. There weren't ghosts or monsters, but someone was up there. Someone who didn't want me around. Someone who waited until night, moved without being seen, and left me signs just subtle enough to scare the hell out of me without ever showing their face. That's worse than anything paranormal, because I know they were real, and they're probably still up there. I never reported it, never went to the police. I didn't have proof, and honestly, I just wanted to forget it. But I never will. That cabin's still out there somewhere off Rattlesnake Ridge, half rotting in the trees, and I'll never step foot near it again. It was the middle of October 2016 when I drove up to a quiet area near the Idaho-Montana border, about 20 miles outside a small town called Libby. I had been living in Spokane back then, and between my job and some personal stuff, I needed a break. A friend of mine who had moved to Canada let me use his old hunting cabin in the woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden structure with a tin roof, one room, a fireplace, and a narrow bed with a foam mattress that smelled like dust and pine. I was 33 at the time. I wasn't some city guy clueless about the woods. I had done a decent amount of hiking and camping, but I'd never stayed alone in a cabin like this before. Still, I wasn't worried. I packed enough food for 5 days, filled up 3 5-gallon jugs with clean water, brought my rifle, my old .40 caliber Glock, and a couple of books I never read. My cell phone had no service, which I expected. The dirt road to the cabin wasn't maintained, and the last half mile I had to cover on foot, dragging a small sled with my stuff on top. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick pine and spruce. There was a fire pit a few feet away, and to the side of the cabin was a rusty old generator that I didn't bother trying to use. I had a headlamp, a bunch of batteries, and a small solar charger for emergencies. The first night was quiet, cold, but peaceful. I made a fire in the small fireplace, cooked up some canned chili on my camp stove, and sat out by the fire pit wrapped in a blanket, just staring up at the trees. The wind would rustle through the tops of them every now and then, but other than that, it was just still. The second day was more of the same. I walked about a mile down a game trail behind the cabin and came across some deer tracks and a half-frozen creek. I sat there for a while, drinking cold coffee and listening to the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt lonely. It felt like the world had just pressed pause for a bit, and I had somehow slipped outside of everything. That night, though, I heard something. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a faint scraping sound outside the cabin. It was slow, like something dragging against wood. I was lying on my back, and I remember just staring at the wooden ceiling, not moving, trying to figure out what the hell it was. My first thought was maybe a raccoon or a porcupine. There was plenty of wildlife out here. I waited. The sound stopped. I didn't hear any footsteps or anything after that, so I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin and checked the siding. There were some scratch marks near the lower part of the back wall. Nothing too deep, but they looked fresh. I crouched down to get a better look. The ground was hard and frozen, so there weren't any footprints. I still wasn't too concerned. Animals scratch at cabins all the time looking for food or just messing around. Still, I kept my Glock on my hip after that. I wasn't worried, but I wasn't going to be stupid either. On the third day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I chopped up some firewood from a dead tree nearby, took some photos of the forest with my old Nikon, and just tried to enjoy being cut off from everything. But I noticed something strange around sunset. The birds were quiet, completely. Usually you'd hear a few calling out before nightfall, but this time it was dead silent. I didn't like that. It's one thing when it's quiet during the day, but right before dark, when everything usually comes alive, that kind of silence felt wrong, like something was out of place. That night, the sound came back. I was just about asleep when I heard it again. That same scraping noise, slow, deliberate. This time, it circled the cabin. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight and my pistol. I didn't turn the light on right away. I just sat there, waiting, listening. The scraping moved toward the front of the cabin. Then I heard a thud, like someone had lightly bumped into the front steps. Not enough to shake the whole cabin, just a soft knock. I waited another minute, then got up, walked slowly to the door, and opened it just a crack. The cold air hit me immediately. I aimed the flashlight outside and swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. I stepped out onto the porch, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other. Still nothing. I scanned the trees, the fire pit, even the roof. Everything looked the same, just still. I went back inside and locked the door. I sat in the chair next to the fireplace with my pistol in my lap until morning. By the fourth day, I was thinking about heading out early. I didn't feel right staying there another night. I told myself it was probably just a mountain lion or maybe even a bear trying to scratch its back against the wood. But that didn't sit right either. The sound was too precise, too slow. That afternoon, I decided to scout the tree line. I wanted to see if I could find any tracks, any broken branches, anything that might give me a clue. About 100 yards into the woods, I found something strange. A rope. It was hanging from a tree branch about 6 feet up. Just a short length of it, maybe 2 feet long, tied into a tight knot at the bottom, like a handle. The other end had been cut clean, not frayed or chewed. I walked around the area, looking for more signs, but found nothing. I left it there and walked back. I didn't want to admit it yet, but something felt wrong in my gut. Something had shifted. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. I wasn't scared exactly, but I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. That night was the worst. I went to bed early, with my Glock on the floor beside me and the rifle propped next to the bed. Around 1 in the morning, I heard the scraping again, but this time it was louder, more aggressive. I stayed in bed, listening. Then I heard the latch on the front door shift. It didn't open, but I heard it move. That door had a metal latch that could only be opened from the inside unless you knew the trick to it. It was old and stiff and made a distinct clack when it moved, and I heard it. I grabbed my pistol, got out of bed, and crept to the door. I didn't open it. I just waited. There was a long pause, then 3 soft taps on the door. Not knocking, just light taps like someone pressing their fingers against the wood. I didn't move. Eventually, the sounds stopped, but I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun came up, I packed everything. I didn't care that I had another day left. I wanted to be out of those woods. I loaded my gear back onto the sled and started the long walk back to my truck. It was a miserable, slow trudge through the trees. The sled kept getting caught on roots and rocks, and my boots were soaked from the dew. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get to the truck and leave. When I finally got to the road, I stopped. There were fresh tire tracks on the dirt path leading up toward the cabin. But I hadn't seen any vehicles, and I didn't hear anyone drive by during the past few days. I bent down and looked closer. They weren't my tire tracks. My truck had old, worn all-terrain tires. These were narrow, almost like they came from a small trailer or maybe a motorcycle. But no bike could make it that far up the road. I didn't waste time trying to figure it out. I ran the last stretch to my truck, threw my stuff in the back, and started the engine. The tank was full. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I drove straight out of there and didn't stop until I reached a gas station near the highway. Once I got signal, I checked the local news. Nothing. No missing persons, no reports of strange activity. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel, too wired to sleep. I kept going over everything in my head. The sounds, the scratch marks, the rope in the woods, the tire tracks. Someone had been out there, watching, maybe playing games. I called my friend a week later and told him he should probably sell the place. He laughed and said I probably spooked myself. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. It wasn't a ghost or some monster in the woods. It was a person, a real person, someone who knew those woods better than I did, someone who didn't want me there. And the scariest part? They never made a sound when they walked. It was the summer of 2019 when I took a break from city life. I'd been living in Indianapolis for the past 6 years, stuck in a never-ending cycle of traffic, bills, emails, and stress. I worked in construction management, long days, constant calls, and barely enough time to breathe. So when my Uncle Henry passed away and left me a small piece of land in Iowa, I didn't think twice before heading out. I needed space. I needed quiet. I figured a few weeks at the old farm would help clear my head. The land was about 40 acres, mostly flat, with cornfields running along the north side and a thick patch of trees lining the southern boundary. The property hadn't been worked in over a decade, but the soil was still good, and the fields looked like someone had been taking care of them at least a little. There was a barn near the front entrance, half collapsed with weathered red paint peeling off the boards. A rusted-out tractor sat beside it, its tires flat, grill full of spiderwebs. A dirt road cut through the property and led to a cabin way out toward the back, past the fields. That's where I stayed. The cabin was small, probably built sometime in the 60s. Just one room with a kitchen and a bed against the wall. It smelled of old wood and damp air. Mice had chewed through the bottom cabinets. The windows were dirty, but they opened wide, and when the wind blew across the fields, it filled the place with cool air that carried the scent of corn and soil. There was no phone signal, no internet, no distractions. I liked that. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up with the sun, walked the fields, cut back some of the overgrown brush, and fixed what I could around the cabin. I started bringing in groceries from town every few days and kept a small cooler going with ice blocks from the gas station. I'd sit outside in the evenings, watching the corn sway in the breeze, sipping coffee or beer. At night, the stars filled the sky. No streetlights, no sounds except crickets, wind, and the occasional howl from something way out in the trees. On the fifth night, something strange happened. I was sitting on the porch around 11 p.m. It was dark, no moon, just stars, and I heard movement out near the cornfield. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or a deer, maybe even a coyote. The sound was soft, like someone brushing through the stalks slowly. I stood up, trying to see anything past the line of crops, but it was pitch black. I stayed still, listening. The rustling stopped. I didn't think much of it until the next morning when I walked to the edge of the cornfield and saw a clear path flattened through the stalks. It was narrow, like someone had walked straight through, dragging something behind them. It started from the edge of the trees and ended about 20 feet into the field. It wasn't animal tracks either, no hoof prints, no paw marks. It looked deliberate. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe I was overthinking it. I told myself that a few weeks alone in the middle of nowhere would naturally get to me. But I still couldn't explain the way the path had looked so straight, so human. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. Around 10 p.m., I locked the door, shut the windows, and pulled the blanket over me. The wind was picking up outside, and I could hear it moving through the corn again. But it was stronger this time, louder, almost like someone was pushing the stalks apart forcefully, not just brushing by. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. The sound would stop, then start again a few seconds later, like whoever or whatever was moving was pausing between steps. I stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, staring at the window, trying to see out, but the glass was too dirty, and the moon wasn't out. I didn't sleep much that night. The following morning, I walked the edge of the cornfield again. There was a new path, wider this time. The stalks had been pushed flat, as if someone had been pacing back and forth. I followed the path in, stepping carefully between the flattened rows. It curved slightly and led me about 30 feet deep, then ended abruptly. But at the end, I found something that chilled me. A deep, rectangular hole in the ground. It was about 6 feet long, maybe 2 feet wide. Not dug with machinery either. The edges were rough and uneven, like someone had used a shovel or even bare hands. There were claw marks, long grooves dug into the soil. I stared at the hole for a long time, then turned and walked straight back to the cabin. I didn't touch it. I didn't fill it in. I didn't even take a picture. I just locked the door, sat down at the kitchen table, and tried to tell myself it was an animal den. But I knew better. It was shaped like a grave. That evening, I started hearing footsteps outside the cabin, soft, slow steps on the gravel and dirt. They circled the house twice before fading toward the trees. I stayed inside, holding a hammer in my hand, watching the door. I didn't have a gun on me. I cursed myself for not bringing one. The next day, I drove into town and picked up a shotgun from a pawn shop and a box of shells. I didn't care how paranoid I looked. Something was out there, and I wasn't going to let it catch me off guard. The next few days were quieter. I didn't see any more paths in the corn, and I kept the shotgun close. I even placed small pieces of thread between the door and frame to check if anyone opened it while I slept. I made sure the windows were latched tight and slept with the light on over the stove. But something still felt wrong, like I was being watched. Then one night it came back. It was just after midnight when I woke up to the sound of wood creaking, slow, heavy pressure on the porch steps. I sat up in bed and grabbed the shotgun. The sound moved closer, board by board, toward the front door. I aimed toward the entrance, breathing slow. The doorknob turned. I jumped up and kicked a chair in front of the door. Nothing pushed it further, but I heard whoever it was breathing, slow, rough breathing, just on the other side of the wood. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then it stopped. Silence. No retreating steps. No movement. I stayed awake until sunrise. When daylight came, I stepped outside, shotgun ready. The porch was covered in fresh dirt, like someone had been standing there barefoot, covered in mud. There were long, smeared footprints leading from the steps toward the cornfield again. I followed them, stopping just before the field's edge. That's when I noticed something new, more holes. 4 of them this time, all the same shape, all about 6 feet long. I didn't go back to the cabin right away. I got in my truck and drove into town. I thought about going to the sheriff, but what was I going to say? That someone was digging graves in my cornfield? That I'd heard footsteps and breathing outside? No one would believe me. Maybe they'd check it out, maybe not. So instead, I bought trail cameras from the hunting store. 6 of them. I spent the rest of the afternoon mounting them on trees around the cabin and aimed 2 right at the field. That night, I stayed in the truck with the shotgun in my lap, watching the cabin from 100 feet away. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement. A figure walked out from the tree line, tall, skinny, covered in something dark, and moved toward the corn. It stopped at the field, looked toward the cabin for a long time, then disappeared into the rows. I waited until sunrise again before checking the cameras. 5 of the 6 had gone dark. Lenses smashed, wires torn. Only one still worked, the one pointed toward the eastern field. I opened the SD card on my laptop and scrubbed through the footage. Around 2:04 a.m., the figure appeared. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, or something close. He was covered in mud from head to toe, wearing no clothes, and moved like he was limping on both legs. His face was hard to make out, blurred and smeared with something dark, but the eyes reflected the infrared like 2 mirrors. He stared at the camera for a solid minute, then walked off screen. That was the last frame. That day, I packed everything. I tossed what I could into the truck, locked the cabin, and left. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the land or the inheritance or what anyone would say. I just drove. I reached Indianapolis before dark and checked into a hotel that night. A week later, I sold the property. I didn't care about the money. I listed it for cheap and never mentioned the cabin or the holes. Some local guy bought it for the field rights. I never heard what happened after, but sometimes I still see those eyes. In dreams, in reflections, even in my own backyard when the wind moves the trees just right. And I never sleep with the windows open anymore. It was 2021 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 34, working a draining job in Leeds as a courier manager, constantly glued to screens, phone calls, and delivery schedules. After months of stress, I just wanted to be alone somewhere quiet, somewhere far. I didn't want to see anyone, didn't want to talk to anyone. I wanted silence, space, and isolation. I found this cabin online. It wasn't on Airbnb or Booking.com. It was one of those older independent rental sites. The photos looked plain. The cabin was small, made of gray weathered wood, surrounded by trees. It had electricity, water from a well, a wood burner, and not much else. The nearest town was about a 25-minute drive away. The man who listed it just emailed me the code to the key lock and gave rough directions through country roads. He said the cabin was on land that used to be part of a private estate. I paid for the week and packed everything I needed: food, layers, books, and a portable battery pack. It was mid-October when I drove up there. The trees were orange and red, and the sky stayed gray all day. There was no signal for miles. I followed the directions. Off the main road onto a narrower road, then down an old gravel path barely wide enough for the car. Finally, I reached it. Just a small, lonely wooden structure tucked among pines and bare ash trees. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside was a small room with a kitchenette, a table, a worn-out armchair, a narrow bed in the corner, and a small wood stove. There was a small bathroom with a compost toilet and a cold shower. No curtains on the windows, just bare glass looking out into the trees. I unpacked slowly. The silence felt thick, almost like a weight. I made tea on the little gas hob, sat in the armchair, and stared out the front window. There was nothing out there, no other buildings, just tall trees swaying a little in the wind. It was peaceful, but as the light started to go, something about it all felt too still. The first night was when I noticed the shape. Around 9 p.m., I was lying in bed reading with a headlamp on. I kept hearing noises from the woods, branches snapping, leaves crunching. I figured it was deer or foxes. But then, when I turned off the lamp and let my eyes adjust to the dark, I saw something. Through the window across from the bed, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees, there was a figure, person, just standing there, not moving. I sat up quickly, heart hammering. I leaned toward the window slowly. She was there, at least I think it was a she. The shape was thin, tall, and wearing something long. I couldn't see a face, but the outline looked like long hair hanging down both sides. She didn't move at all. I froze. I don't know how long I just stared. Could have been 10 seconds. Could have been a full minute. Then I reached for the lamp, clicked it on, and when I looked back out the window, she was gone. I didn't sleep well after that. I kept the lamp on just in case and kept checking out the windows every hour. The next day, I convinced myself it was a tree stump or something, maybe a trick of the light. Maybe I was overtired from the long drive and the silence was playing tricks on me. I went for a walk along the edge of the woods, found a path that looped around some old stone walls, and tried to relax. But I kept thinking about that figure. I didn't see any footprints, no other sign that anyone had been out there, no other cabins or structures nearby. I'd looked at satellite maps before booking. This cabin was alone. The second night, I tried to block out the windows with some towels I brought. It didn't help. Around midnight, I heard the doorknob rattle, just once. Not loud, not shaking, just a single soft turn. I was lying in bed again with the headlamp off, and I sat bolt upright when I heard it. I didn't move for a while. Then I crept up to the door and checked the lock. It was still bolted. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in the chair and stared out through the tiny front window. Nothing moved, but the feeling stayed, the feeling that someone was out there. On the third day, I thought about leaving. I packed my bag, even put everything back in the car. But I stopped myself. It was a long drive back, and I kept thinking I'd feel silly once I got home. It was probably an animal, maybe wind shaking the knob. The weather was turning, and I thought maybe I was just paranoid. That afternoon, I walked further into the woods, toward the direction where I saw the woman on the first night. About 200 yards in, I found a small clearing. There were old stones like markers, almost like unmarked graves. They weren't modern. Looked like they'd been there for decades, maybe longer, moss-covered and chipped. It was weird, but not unusual for old land in the UK. There were often bits of forgotten history buried in private estates. That night, it got worse. At around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate ones, crunching leaves. I turned off the headlamp and stayed still in bed. The footsteps circled the cabin once, maybe twice. Then they stopped by the back window, the one above the sink. I waited. Then I heard breathing. Slow, heavy, right outside the window. I didn't look. Couldn't. I just lay there, barely breathing myself, counting seconds. After maybe 5 minutes, I heard the steps again. Then silence. The next morning, I found footprints, bare feet, in the cold October mud. They were long, thin prints that went all the way around the cabin, stopping near the back, just like I heard. I wanted to leave, but the car battery had died. I must have left the lights on when I repacked the day before. There was no signal to call for help, no neighbors nearby. I was stuck. I had jump cables, but no second car. I spent the whole day inside with a kitchen knife in my hand. Every sound from the woods made me jump. I blocked every window with anything I could find. At one point, I thought I saw someone watching from between two trees, but when I looked again, there was nothing. That night, I didn't sleep, just sat in the corner with my flashlight and knife. Around 3 a.m., I heard tapping on the front window. 3 slow taps, then silence. She didn't try the door this time, but I saw her. I didn't want to, but I looked through the small gap in the towel I'd hung. She was right there, inches from the glass. A pale woman with tangled gray-blonde hair, deep lines on her face, and eyes that didn't blink. Her clothes looked like they were from another time, maybe 1950s or 60s, long brown dress, stained and wet at the bottom. She didn't move. She just stared. Her eyes didn't even shift when I moved the towel slightly. Then she smiled, just a small curl of her lips. Then she turned and walked slowly into the woods. I finally slept for about an hour after the sun came up. When I woke up, I packed everything, pushed the car out onto the dirt road, and started walking down the hill with my jumper cables. After about an hour of walking, I found a farm with a landline phone. The man there helped me jump the car and didn't ask many questions. Maybe I looked too shaken to talk. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Back home, I searched for information about that area. I found some records about the estate that used to own the land. Turns out it had belonged to a wealthy family in the 1920s. There were stories of a woman who lived there alone after her husband died in the war. She refused to leave when the land was sold and was eventually evicted in the 60s. No one knew what happened to her after that. Her name was Martha Hartley. I looked at an old black and white photo someone had uploaded in a local history forum. It was her. Same hair, same eyes, same faint smile. But that wasn't the part that stayed with me the most. A few weeks later, I got an email from the man who rented me the cabin. It just said, "You left the back door unbolted. It was wide open when I went to clean. Please be more careful." I hadn't opened the back door. Not once. I had checked it every night, locked it, bolted it. I hadn't even touched it since the day I arrived. I don't go to remote places anymore. I don't camp. I don't hike alone. And I never, ever ignore the feeling when something feels wrong. Because that cabin in Northumberland, it was real. She was real. And I don't think she ever left that land. Back in the fall of 2014, I took a break from everything. I had just turned 34 and had been grinding nonstop at my job in Kansas City. I worked security for a logistics company, mostly night shifts, and after 9 years of that, I felt drained. The insomnia, the constant fatigue, the never-ending dull roar of the city, it got under my skin. I didn't have kids. I wasn't married. And I figured if there was ever a time to get away, it was then. A friend of mine, Will, had an old hunting cabin in eastern Missouri near a place called Marthasville. The area was pretty wooded, remote, not exactly off-grid, but close enough. He said I could stay there for a few weeks, no charge, just keep an eye on the place. He hadn't used it in years and mentioned that the back part of the property butted up against an old graveyard. Said it was fenced off and hadn't been used since the early 60s. That didn't bother me. I needed silence and graves didn't talk. I packed up my truck with a cooler, food, bottled water, some old paperback books, a cot, some clothes, my 12 gauge, and some tools just in case. I got out there around noon on a Thursday. The road that led to the cabin was more like a pair of faint tire ruts running through tall grass and soft dirt. Trees overhung most of the path, some of them damn near scraping the sides of the truck. I had to crawl the last mile in 4WD. The cabin itself was rough but solid. One room with stove, old rusted sink, busted up table, and some chairs that looked like they hadn't been sat in since the 80s. The windows had glass, surprisingly. No power, no water, no cell service. Just 4 walls, a roof, and nothing else around. That first day, I set up my cot near the back wall and aired the place out. The air inside smelled like mildew and old smoke, but it was dry. I brought out a folding chair and sat on the porch most of the afternoon, looking out toward the thick trees that wrapped around the clearing. The graveyard was just out of view behind a hill and some woods. I didn't bother checking it out the first day. I just wanted quiet. The second day, I walked the whole property. Will said the land was maybe 10 acres, give or take, and bordered a little forgotten county cemetery called Franklin Rest. It wasn't on any big maps, just a few rows of weather-worn headstones under some cedar trees. The path to it from the cabin was barely there anymore, just a gap in the trees behind the cabin that sloped down a hill. I followed it around noon. The cemetery was smaller than I imagined. Maybe 20 headstones, half of them cracked or leaning. No signs, no fencing, just stone markers rising from dead leaves and vines. Most of the names were unreadable. The dates I could make out were all from the 1920s through the 50s. Some were kids. A few were just single names and a year. The wind barely moved down there, and I couldn't hear birds. I walked through it slowly, careful not to step on anything that looked like a grave. I didn't feel anything weird, just old silence. The kind of silence you only get in places no one's visited in years. I stood in the middle of the graveyard for a while, hands in my pockets, and then I turned around and walked back to the cabin. That night, it got cold. I had the stove going, but the heat didn't hold long in a place that drafty. I wrapped up in my sleeping bag and listened to the wind outside. I remember the wind making the trees creak all night. It didn't bother me, but I noticed it. Just long groans like old floorboards. Normal sounds for woods that thick. The third day is when things started to feel off. I went out for firewood early, dragging my little saw with me. I was maybe 50 yards off the north side of the cabin, near a dry creek, when I saw an old wooden post sticking up from the brush. It was short, maybe 2 feet tall, with rusted metal loops on it. I thought it might have been part of an old fence, but the post was by itself. No others near it. I cleared some leaves around the base and saw there was another stone lying almost flat. Looked like another grave marker. It wasn't in the graveyard, though. It was too far out. I brushed it off. Names were worn smooth. Only thing I could see was 1927, carved deep on the bottom. I left it and went back to cutting wood. But that night, I noticed something strange. As I was sitting out on the porch around dusk, I saw something move down by the trees where the trail to the graveyard started. It was just a shadow or something breaking the line of light for a second. I froze and watched, expecting maybe a deer or a raccoon, but nothing moved again. I kept staring at the spot for a while, and then I slowly got up and went inside, locked the door, not because I was scared, just instinct. Next morning, I found something weird behind the cabin. There was a small pile of rocks at the edge of the path to the graveyard. It hadn't been there before. Maybe 8 or 9 small flat stones, stacked about a foot high, right at the tree line. I checked for tracks, but the leaves were dry and nothing was clear. Could have been some kid messing around years ago, but the rocks looked recently moved. I kicked the stack over and didn't think much of it. Later that day, I hiked deeper into the woods just to get a feel for the land. I went a little beyond the cemetery, maybe a quarter mile in, and found an old campsite. Rusted cans, burnt logs, melted plastic. Looked like someone had camped there years back. It wasn't fresh. What was strange was how hidden it was. You couldn't see it unless you were right on top of it, almost like someone meant to hide it. I went back to the cabin, feeling a little uneasy. That night, the woods were dead quiet. No wind, no creaking trees, nothing. I slept light. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw footprints in the dirt. Not mine, bare feet, human.
Nos shoes.
The prints were wide and flat, toes spread, like someone walked through soft dirt behind the cabin during the night. I followed them. They came from the woods and stopped about 10 feet from my back window. Then they turned and went back the way they came. I didn't panic, but my stomach tightened. I spent the next few hours checking the windows, checking the trail to the cemetery, checking my shotgun. I didn't see anything else. That evening, I walked back to the cemetery again. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself nothing was wrong. But when I got there, I saw something that made me stop cold. There were more rock piles, 6 of them, neatly stacked, each one sitting in front of a headstone, almost like offerings. I didn't touch them this time. I just stood there. I was starting to feel watched. Not in a crazy way, just the kind of feeling where your skin gets tight, like someone's eyes are on you. I walked back faster than usual. I kept my hand on my belt the whole way. The next night, I stayed inside. Around midnight, I heard something tapping on the wall. Like, not banging, just soft knocks spaced out. I sat up in the dark and listened. Came again. 1 knock, then nothing, then another knock. A pause, then 3 in a row. I got up, grabbed the shotgun, and stood still, trying not to breathe. The tapping stopped. I waited 30 minutes before I moved again. Didn't open the door. Didn't look out the window. Just stood there until it got light. The next day, I found more bare footprints near the porch. This time they were smeared, like someone had been pacing back and forth in a tight circle. I should have left then, packed up and gone. But something in me wanted to know what the hell was going on. I walked back to the old hidden campsite beyond the graveyard. I looked closer this time. There were old rags tied to a branch like a signal. The fire pit was filled with fresh ashes. I touched the rocks, still warm. I turned around and walked fast. As I came back around the cemetery, I saw something new, a fresh dug hole. It wasn't wide, just maybe 4 feet long, 2 feet wide. But it was clean, fresh dirt, damp around the edges. It hadn't rained. No animal had done that. Someone had used a shovel. I ran back to the cabin, heart hammering. I grabbed my stuff, everything I could throw into the truck in 5 minutes. I wasn't even thinking straight, just pure adrenaline. I kept the shotgun on the passenger seat and didn't stop moving. As I pulled out of the clearing, I looked in the rearview mirror. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees.
Nos shirt. Nos shoes.
Just staring. I drove like hell down that trail, hit the highway, and didn't stop until I was halfway to St. Louis. I told Will what happened. He didn't believe me, not really. Said I must have been tired. Maybe had a bad dream. I don't care. I never went back. He sold the land 6 months later. I still think about that hole, that stack of rocks, those footprints. And every once in a while, I wonder how long that person had been watching me before I noticed them, or if they were already sleeping in that graveyard when I first arrived. All I know is this: whoever they weren't living like the rest of us, and they sure as hell didn't want me there. I was 34 when I decided to get away from everything. Life in the city had worn me down. I was living in Omaha, Nebraska, working a maintenance job at a concrete plant, and the days had started to blur together. Long hours, hard work, and barely any time to think. It wasn't bad work, but I felt stuck, like I was grinding through each day just waiting for the next to hit me the same way. After a rough breakup and a falling out with my younger brother over something stupid, I knew I needed to step away from people for a while. So I took a long unpaid leave, cashed out most of my savings, and bought a small piece of land out in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. It was remote, surrounded by thick woods and hills, with no neighbors for miles. The land was cheap, probably because of how hard it was to access. The dirt road leading to it had ruts deep enough to eat tires whole, and I had to chain up my pickup just to get through. But I liked it. I liked the idea of building something with my hands and sleeping away from traffic, noise, and problems. The land was about 3.4 acres, mostly pine and hickory, with a little creek on the far edge that trickled past a set of moss-covered rocks. There was no house, no power lines, and no cell signal. I knew I wasn't going to build anything fancy, just a small off-grid cabin where I could sleep, think, and let my head quiet down. It was early October 2022 when I first drove up there with tools in the back of my truck and a tarp wrapped around a pile of pressure-treated lumber. The mornings were crisp, and the trees had just started to turn yellow and red. I spent the first few days just clearing brush, picking a flat spot near the base of a gentle hill, and marking out the footprint of the cabin. 10 feet by 12, with a 6-foot porch off the front. Nothing big, just a dry roof and for walls I could sit inside. The building part wasn't hard for me. I'd done carpentry on and off with my dad when I was younger. The tough part was doing it alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to spot me if I dropped something or fell. I worked slow and careful, slept in the bed of the truck at night, and cooked on a propane stove under the stars. There were a few animals around, deer, armadillos, raccoons, and once I saw what looked like a black bear way out near the creek. But it didn't bother me. I kept my tools locked up and food sealed tight, and nothing went missing. One afternoon, maybe a week in, I noticed the clouds starting to build out west. I'd been watching the weather before I came out here, but cell service didn't work this deep into the hills. The wind picked up late in the day, and by the time I'd raised 3 walls and nailed in half the roof panels, I felt that kind of damp air that only comes before a long, hard rain. I decided to stay and finish what I could. I was already dirty and tired, and I figured I'd just wrap the open side with tarp and sleep inside the shell. I wanted to see what it felt like to spend the night in something I'd built myself. The rain started around 7:30. First, just a few drops on the roof like acorns falling. Then it opened up and started pouring. I'd put the tarp over the open wall with heavy clamps and weighed it down with a sawhorse. But the wind got under it fast and flapped it like a loose sail. Rain sprayed sideways and soaked the floorboards I just screwed down. I sat inside with my sleeping bag wrapped around me, my back against one of the upright studs, watching water drip off the rafters. The sound of rain hitting the metal roof was deafening, but I liked it at first. It felt like I'd built a shelter in a storm, something primal, like I had beat the weather by putting a roof over my head. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. I can't explain it well, but it was like my nerves couldn't calm down. I wasn't thinking about anything bad. No fear, no dark thoughts, but my body was tense. My ears kept trying to listen for something, and I noticed I was holding my breath now and then, like I was waiting for something to happen. Every little knock from the woods or gust of wind made me flinch. The rain had that way of distorting sound, bouncing off the metal, making it hard to tell where anything was coming from. There were no crickets, no frogs, nothing. Just the sound of water pouring down and wind shaking the trees. At one point, maybe around midnight, I thought I heard something that didn't match the rest of the storm. A dull thump, not sharp like a branch falling, but flat and heavy, like something stepping onto wet ground. I sat still, held my breath, and waited. Then I heard it again. Not loud, just deliberate. One soft crunch, then another spaced out by several seconds. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, but the beam was weak and barely lit the interior. I swung it toward the open tarp wall, shining through the flap where the wind had pulled the edge loose. There was nothing there, just rain falling in sheets and the dark tree line about 30 feet out. I told myself it was probably a deer or a wild pig. I'd seen tracks near the creek. Still, I couldn't relax. I ended up pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me, tucking myself against the back wall, and watching the tarp flap in the wind for hours. Eventually, I must have dozed off. I woke up to a flash of lightning, bright and close. The thunder cracked like a bomb right after, and the walls of the cabin creaked from the wind. Water was running across the floor now. The tarp had blown fully open on one side, and the rain was blowing in. I sat up and grabbed my boots, slipped them on fast, and went to try and resecure the tarp. That's when I saw them. Not people, not animals, just prints. In the mud outside the cabin, bare feet, human-sized but deep and wide, and pointed toward the opening where I'd been sleeping. Not old prints either. The edges hadn't softened or pooled. They were fresh. I stared at them in the beam of my flashlight, rain running down my neck, heart pounding so hard it made me dizzy. I stepped outside, squinting into the woods, but saw nothing. No movement, no lights, no sounds. Just the storm and the forest. I went back in, sealed the opening as best I could, and didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the prints were half washed away. I stood there staring at the smeared shapes in the mud, trying to decide if I was losing it. Maybe I'd made them myself somehow. Maybe they were a trick of the light and the storm, but they hadn't been mine. I'd been inside, and I wasn't barefoot. I packed up my things, drove back to town that afternoon, and spent a night in a cheap motel just to feel carpet under my feet and hear traffic again. I thought about selling the land, quitting the whole project. But after a day or two of sitting in silence and thinking it over, I decided to go back. Not because I wasn't scared, but because I needed to finish what I started. Over the next few weeks, I worked faster. I got the cabin sealed up, added a locking door, installed a wood stove, and reinforced the roof. I brought a trail cam and set it up pointing at the edge of the woods. Every night I stayed there after that, I kept a hammer and a flashlight right next to my bedroll. I never saw any more prints. The trail cam never picked up anything strange. I stayed out there for almost 3 months, finished the cabin, added a table, a cot, and shelves. I even spent Christmas there, chopping firewood and drinking coffee while snow fell outside. Felt peaceful after a while. Not safe, but peaceful. Like I'd earned the quiet. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a hiker, lost and wandering in the storm. But it didn't feel like that. The prince stopped right at the door and didn't go anywhere else. No return path, no signs of someone retreating. Just a visitor who watched, then left. I still go out there sometimes. Less than I used to, but the cabin's mine now. Solid, dry, and standing. When it rains, I sit inside, listen to it drumming on the roof, and watch the woods. But I always keep the door locked now, even if I'm just stepping outside for firewood, because I know someone else was out there once, and maybe they still are. It was October 2022 when I finally got a break from work and decided to take a week off. I was 34 then, living in northern Idaho. My job was mostly desk work, staring at screens, talking to people I didn't care about, and going through the same routine every day. I felt like I was wearing myself out mentally. I didn't want to deal with people, emails, or traffic. I just wanted to be in the woods with my dog. I had a 2-year-old German Shepherd named Duke. He was loyal, smart, and full of energy. I raised him from a pup. He was more than a pet. He was company when I needed it and a kind of quiet protector when I didn't realize I needed one. The plan was simple. Drive up into the forest, hike a little, and stay at a small off-grid cabin I had bought earlier that year. I hadn't spent more than a night there since buying it, and I wanted to get away for at least 5 days, maybe more if things went well. The cabin was about 4.5 hours away, close to the Canadian border. It was down an old logging road that hadn't been maintained for years. You could only get there with a 4x4 vehicle, and even then, it was slow and rough. I had a 2011 Toyota Tacoma with off-road tires, and even that struggled in some spots. There were no nearby houses, no cell signal, no power lines, just trees, mountains, and silence. I liked it that way. I packed enough food, water, and gear to last a week. I brought in firewood, propane canisters, batteries, and a couple of large jugs of water. I had a sleeping bag, heavy-duty tarp, axe, tools, and a 9mm Glock I kept locked in a metal box in the truck. Not because I was paranoid, just because it was smart. You never knew when you might run into a bear or something else. The drive up was uneventful. Duke slept most of the way, curled up in the back seat. As we got closer to the cabin, I started to feel something shift. Not in a bad way, but like stepping into a different kind of world. There were no gas stations or towns in the last hour of the drive. Just trees. The road narrowed, and the forest closed in, branches tapping against the sides of the truck. When I finally pulled into the clearing where the cabin stood, the light was soft and gold through the trees. It wasn't big, maybe 16 by 20 feet. One room, wood frame, metal roof, a stone chimney at one end. The grass around it was long, wet, and flattened by past rains. I parked the truck facing the path, just in case I needed to leave in a hurry. Duke jumped out the moment I opened the door and ran circles through the grass, his nose going wild. I checked the cabin. Everything was just as I left it in spring. A few cobwebs, some mouse droppings in the corners, but nothing serious. I aired it out, unpacked my stuff, and started a fire in the wood stove. The air inside turned from damp and cold to dry and warm in about an hour. That first night was calm. I cooked some beans, had some bread and jerky, and fed Duke a bowl of dry food. He curled up beside me on the old rug, and I read a paperback book by headlamp. Around midnight, I turned off the light, crawled into my sleeping bag on the raised cot I had built, and let the sound of the wind in the trees lull me to sleep. The next day it rained. It didn't stop for 2 days straight. I didn't mind the rain. I liked the sound of it on the metal roof. It felt like a barrier between me and the rest of the world. The first morning, I made coffee on the propane stove and stepped outside under the porch roof, watching the mist creep through the trees. Duke didn't seem to mind either. He stayed near the cabin, sniffing and chasing squirrels. I built a small covered area using the tarp to keep some wood dry and spent time chopping logs and stacking them neatly. But by the third day, something started to feel off. Not wrong exactly, just slightly uncomfortable, like wearing a shirt that doesn't fit right or standing in a room where someone had just been but was now gone. It was little things at first. I'd wake up and find the tarp corner loose, even though I tied it tight the day before. One of the pieces of firewood I stacked would be lying in the mud. I chalked it up to wind, but the wind wasn't strong. Then on the fourth night, just after midnight, Duke growled. He was lying near the door when it happened. His ears perked up, and a low, steady growl started in his chest. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away. I just listened. The rain had stopped. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Duke stood, walked slowly to the door, and sniffed along the base of it. His tail was stiff. I walked to the window, the one facing the path, and looked out. Nothing, just black trees and the faint glow of fog in the moonlight. I turned the flashlight on and stepped outside. Duke followed. I swept the beam across the clearing. Everything looked normal. I walked to the edge of the tree line, feeling exposed in my socks and thermal shirt. The ground was soggy under my feet. That's when I saw it. A footprint. Not an animal print, a human one, barefoot. It was in the mud about 20 feet from the cabin.
Nos chus, no trer.
Toes, heel, arch clear as day. One single print, like someone had stepped out of the trees and stood there watching. But there were no others. I checked in a circle, shining the light in every direction. No broken branches, no second print, just the one. And then it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and sat with the gun in my lap, ears straining. Duke never barked, but he stayed awake too, staring at the door like he was waiting for something to come through it. When morning finally came, I checked the clearing again. The print was washed out now, just a mess of leaves and mud. I tried to tell myself I imagined it, or maybe it had been mine somehow, but that didn't make sense. I had boots on the whole time and my prints had tread. This one didn't. I thought about leaving, but I stayed. Part of me didn't want to believe anything was wrong. I convinced myself it could have been a hiker, some lost guy who wandered past without shoes. Strange, but possible. The cabin was remote, but people still came through this area sometimes. Hunters, campers, crazy people. That night, I locked the door. I used a heavy crossbar I had made just in case. It fit between two metal brackets and would take serious force to break through. I shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Duke lay near the stove, his body stiff. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard a noise. Not an animal, not wind, something tapping.
Top, top, top.
Came from the back wall near the window. I didn't move at first. I just listened.
Top, top.
I stood up slowly, grabbed the flashlight, and moved to the wall. I didn't turn the light on. I just stood there, pressing my ear to the wood. Nothing. Then I heard it again. But this time it was on the other side, the front.
Top.
I turned the flashlight on and threw open the curtain. Nothing. Just trees. Duke was standing now, hackles raised. I didn't sleep that night either. By the 5th day, I had made up my mind. I was leaving the next morning, no matter what. I packed some things early, reloaded the truck, and filled the tank from my reserve can. That afternoon, I took Duke for one last walk along the trail behind the cabin, a loop I had cleared during the summer. We walked slow. The forest was damp and heavy with silence. I kept looking behind me. Duke kept stopping, ears twitching. We were halfway back when I saw something hanging from a tree branch. It was a piece of red cloth, torn, dirty, and tied into a knot. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't mine. I pulled it down and looked at it.
No markings.
Just faded fabric. That was it. I ran back to the cabin, Duke at my heels. I didn't sleep that night either. I kept the fire burning and sat in the corner with my back to the wall. Duke didn't lie down once. He paced and sniffed the floor, growling low every now and then. By sunrise, I was already driving. I didn't look back. I got home late that night, dumped all my gear in the garage, and gave Duke a full meal. I sat on the floor beside him and just let everything sink in. I don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a ghost. It was a person, a real one. Someone had been watching us, maybe for days, maybe from the trees, maybe from the hill above the cabin. They didn't try to break in. They didn't leave tracks, just one footprint and a piece of cloth. They wanted us to know they were there. I haven't gone back since. I put the cabin up for sale 3 months later. No one's bought it yet, and Duke still growls when the wind hits the house at night, like he remembers, just like I do. My name's Caleb Warner. I'm 39 years old. Back in October 2022, I took time off from my job in Colorado Springs to finally work on a book I had been putting off for years. I'd been saving up for a while, and after searching listings for a quiet spot in nature, I found a cabin way up in the mountains of central Idaho. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. I found it through a small, independent rental site that mostly posted places with no frills.
No luxury.
Just walls, a roof, and peace. The kind of thing someone like me was looking for.
No neighbors.
No traffic. Just trees, wind, and time. It was about an hour and a half from the nearest real town, Salmon, Idaho. I drove in with my Ford Explorer packed with supplies. I didn't want to go in and out every week, so I filled the whole back with canned food, dry rice, pasta, peanut butter, jerky, protein bars, coffee, whiskey, and water. I had a generator in the back, plus a few gas cans, and a bunch of firewood I grabbed at a gas station along the way. I had my laptop, a solar charger, a basic emergency kit, and a hunting rifle that had belonged to my dad. The drive up the dirt road to the cabin was long and bumpy. There weren't any signs or markers after a certain point, just GPS and instinct. The road turned from dirt to packed rock, and then to barely anything at all. I remember stopping a few times to get out and move fallen branches or to check if I was even still on the trail. When I reached the place, it was smaller than I expected. Just one room and a loft. No running water, but there was a pump out back. A wood stove. A sagging little deck out front. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and mouse droppings. There were rodent pellets on the shelves, under the cot, even inside the old stove. I spent the first couple hours cleaning before I even brought my gear inside. By the time I unpacked and got the generator set up, it was almost dark. There were no curtains, so when the sun went down, the windows turned into dark mirrors. I don't care how tough you are. When you're alone out in the woods and there's no cell service, you feel something. Not fear exactly, just a weight pressing on your chest. I stayed up that first night reading an old field manual by lantern light, just to keep my mind busy. I hadn't seen a single person on the drive up, not even a tire track in the dirt. That's what I wanted, of course. But there's a difference between wanting to be alone and realizing you actually are. The next day, I woke up early and went to work. I set up my laptop on a folding table by the window, poured myself some gritty instant coffee, and started writing. The silence was perfect. I could hear everything. Wind in the pines, birds moving from branch to branch, the ticking of the stove as it cooled. It was good, really good. For the first time in years, I felt like I could actually focus. No email, no coworkers dropping by my office, no distractions. Every now and then, I'd get up and stretch, walk the perimeter of the cabin, or take a quick hike up the hill behind it. The view was incredible, rolling woods for miles, broken up only by patches of exposed rock and a creek far below. I had cell service only if I hiked halfway up the hill. Even then, it was weak and slow. By the 5th day, I was really in the zone. I had written nearly 20,000 words and had no plans of stopping. I felt better than I had in years. But things started to shift after that. Not all at once, just little details at first. It started with the path out front. I had made a habit of sweeping the dirt off the small deck each morning. It was part of my routine. But on the morning of the 6th day, I saw a shoe print near the steps. A real, full print. Not mine. I wore big, thick hunting boots. These were smaller. Like a men's size 9 maybe. I looked around but didn't see anything else. No marks in the dirt leading to or from it. Just the one clean print. I stared at it for a long time, then took a stick and wiped it away. I told myself it must have been old. Maybe from someone who had rented the place before. But I hadn't seen it the day before. And there'd been a light rain 2 nights earlier. It should have washed away anything like that. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept the rifle by the cot and left the lantern on. My mind kept going back to the print. I couldn't hear anything outside, but that didn't help. Sometimes silence is worse than noise. At least when you hear something, you know where it is. The next day, I didn't write much. I spent most of the morning checking the windows, scanning the tree line, listening. I walked down the trail a bit with the rifle slung over my shoulder, pretending I was just going for a walk. But I wasn't. I was looking for another print. Broken branches. Anything. I didn't find anything. Until that night. I had just shut the generator off and was getting into the sleeping bag when I heard something outside. A creak. Like a floorboard. Except there weren't any outside. Just that little sagging deck. I didn't move. Just laid there in the dark with my eyes open. Listening. Then another sound. A soft thump. I reached out and grabbed the rifle. I didn't switch on the lantern. Didn't want to give away my position. Instead, I slowly stood up and moved to the window. The moon was out. I could see the deck. Nothing there. But I could feel it. I knew someone was out there. I waited for almost 10 minutes, just frozen in place, trying not to breathe loud. Then I saw something. A shape. Movement near the trees. Person. Just standing behind a pine maybe 30 yards out. Watching. I couldn't see their face. They didn't have a flashlight. Didn't move. I stayed there until my legs started to shake. Then, finally, the figure turned and walked off into the woods. Slow.
No rush.
The next morning, I packed. I told myself I'd drive into town and maybe come back after a few days. But when I got outside, I saw something that changed everything. Sitting on the steps of the deck was a Polaroid photo. Face down. I picked it up. It was me, sleeping, in the cot, taken from outside the window, probably from the brush behind the cabin. I could see my arm draped over the side, my phone charging next to me, the lantern on the floor, everything. My mouth went dry. I looked around in every direction. Nothing, just trees and cold air. I threw everything into the truck as fast as I could. Left half the food, my folding table, even some of my clothes behind. Just grabbed the laptop, the rifle, the gas cans, and left. The road was worse going down. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every turn felt like a trap. I made it to the highway and drove all the way back to Colorado in one push. 14 hours. I didn't even stop to eat. When I got home, I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that the photo was a prank, that maybe someone else had stayed there and left it as a joke. But there was no way. It was me, taken that same week, that same sleeping bag, that same position. I called the number from the rental site. It was disconnected. The entire listing was gone by the time I checked again. I never reported it to the police. What would I say? Someone watched me sleep and left a photo? I had no license plate, no name, no proof. Just a creepy picture and a feeling that still hasn't left me. I still have the photo. It's in a drawer in my office under some old bills and tax papers. Sometimes I take it out and look at it. Not because I want to, but because I need to remind myself it happened. That it was real. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I don't even like camping anymore. I sleep with blackout curtains and a motion sensor light outside my apartment now. And every so often, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I check the window, just in case, because I never heard the shutter click. Whoever took that picture did it quietly, which means they were close, maybe closer than I'll ever know. I was 38 when I decided to spend a week alone in the countryside. It was early October 2019, and I had just quit my job at a printing company in Indiana after working there for over 13 years. I wasn't burned out, just tired of routine. I needed quiet. I needed something to break the cycle of the same mornings, same roads, same faces. A friend of mine named Ryan had a small wooden cabin sitting alone on his family's old farmland in southern Illinois, about 4 miles outside a town called Browning Hill. The town wasn't much, maybe 100 people, mostly farms, no real stores aside from a small gas station and a diner that opened when it felt like it. Ryan's family had long moved away, but the cabin was still standing. He'd used it for hunting season in the past, but hadn't been back in years. I asked him if I could use it for a week. He gave me the key and a printed map, then told me to text him when I got there. The drive from Indianapolis took about 4.5 hours. It was late afternoon when I turned onto the gravel road leading to the property. The last paved road had been behind me for at least 20 minutes. The area felt forgotten. Cornfields stretched in every direction, some already harvested, others still standing tall and dry. I saw no houses, no cars, just that steady quiet that only exists when you're far from towns or traffic. The cabin was old but solid. It sat near the edge of a wide clearing, surrounded by trees on 3 sides and open fields out front. The wood siding was darkened from years of sun and rain, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. Inside, it was basic, just one room with a bed, a small wood stove, an old table with 2 chairs, and some shelves nailed to the wall. There was no electricity, but Ryan had warned me about that. I brought a big cooler, a solar lantern, and a battery pack to charge my phone. I spent the first couple of days just walking the land, reading, and trying to slow my thoughts down. I made coffee on a propane stove, kept a journal, and sat on the porch for hours just watching the wind move across the fields. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. On the 3rd night, something strange happened. It was around 2 a.m. I had been asleep when I woke suddenly, not from a sound exactly, more like from a feeling. You know how sometimes you just wake up and feel off, like something is wrong, even if you can't explain it? That's how it felt. The cabin was silent. No wind.
No bugs.
Just heavy stillness. I reached for the lantern and turned it on, filling the room with soft yellow light. I sat up in bed, listening. I didn't hear anything at first. I looked at the window near the front of the cabin, which faced the field. It was dark outside, but I noticed something. The curtain wasn't quite closed all the way. I saw just a sliver of the field through the crack. And in that thin gap, I thought I saw movement. I stared for a long time. Maybe it was just the breeze. But there was no breeze. Everything was dead still. I got up slowly and walked to the window. I pulled the curtain open just a few inches and looked out. There was a man standing in the field. He was about 50 feet from the cabin, just outside the tall grass, near where the field met the tree line. He wasn't moving. He was facing the cabin. I couldn't see his face, but he looked tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and was wearing a jacket and a cap. His arms were at his sides. He wasn't holding anything, not that I could see. I didn't move. I just stared, waiting for him to do something. But he didn't. He stood completely still. It was almost like a statue. After maybe 30 seconds, I backed away from the window, careful not to make a sound. I turned off the lantern and stood in the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I stayed on the floor, out of view from the windows, my ears tuned to every sound. I didn't hear anything else. When the sun started rising, I finally looked outside again. The field was empty. There was no sign of anyone. I told myself it could have been a hunter or someone passing through. Maybe just a local who wandered too far. But I couldn't explain why he stood there so long or why he was staring at the cabin. That day, I walked the area. I looked for boot prints or tire tracks, anything that might explain what I saw. The ground was dry and hard, but I did find something. Bent grass, as if someone had stood in that spot. It was flattened in a way that matched what I saw from the window. I walked into the woods a bit, but I didn't see any trails or other signs. That night, I kept the lantern off and stayed in bed with my ears open. Nothing happened, but the night after that, things got worse. Around midnight, I heard something scrape across the front porch. It sounded like a boot dragging slowly across the wood. Then silence. Then it came again, slow, deliberate steps. I didn't move. My heart was thumping in my chest so loud I felt like he could hear it from outside. I reached slowly for the small hatchet I kept near the bed. It wasn't much, but it was something. I waited. I didn't hear knocking. No voice. Just those slow steps, then nothing. I couldn't see out the window without moving, and I didn't want to risk it. After maybe 20 minutes, the steps came again, this time moving away from the cabin. I stayed awake until sunrise again. When I opened the door the next morning, I found something sitting on the porch, a piece of string tied into a small loop, sitting right in the middle of the wooden floorboards. Just sitting there. I didn't touch it. I kicked it off the porch into the weeds and walked the field again, trying to calm myself down. I kept asking myself, what kind of person does this? What's the point? Why not say something or just leave? I kept thinking maybe it was a trespasser messing with me, but nothing made sense. On the 6th night, everything broke. I had packed my things earlier that day. I'd had enough. I was going to leave in the morning. I had the car loaded and was just using the cabin one last night to sleep before the drive. I stayed up late reading with the lantern on. Around 1 a.m., I turned it off and lay in bed. Then I heard the door handle rattle. Not hard, not loud, just a soft jiggle, like someone was trying it, checking if it was unlocked. I froze. The handle turned back and forth, then stopped. Then I heard slow footsteps moving around the side of the cabin, then to the back. I could hear the dry leaves crunch under heavy boots. I sat up, grabbed the hatchet, and quietly moved to the other side of the room, staying out of view. I didn't breathe. I waited. Then the footsteps stopped. For a long time, I didn't hear anything. Then the worst sound yet. Something scraping across the back wall. A slow drag like a nail or a piece of metal being run along the wood siding. It moved from one corner of the cabin to the other. I snapped. I grabbed the lantern, flicked it on, threw the door open, and stepped out with the hatchet raised. Nothing. The field was empty. I ran around the cabin with the lantern held high. Nothing. No one. I don't know how long I stood out there, breathing hard, scanning the tree line. But whoever it was, they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car with the hatchet in my lap until the sun came up. Then I drove away without looking back. I never went back to that cabin. I told Ryan what happened and gave him back the key. He seemed surprised but didn't say much. A few months later, he told me he had driven out there and found nothing strange. He said the place was fine, but that wasn't true. 2 years later, I read an article online about a missing man from the Browning Hill area. They found his truck parked near an abandoned barn not far from where the cabin stood. No signs of foul play, no body, just an empty vehicle and a set of footprints leading into the woods that stopped halfway through a field. I don't know who the man in the field was. I don't know what he wanted. I don't think he was trying to kill me, at least not right away. I think he liked watching. I think he wanted to see fear grow slowly. I think some people just enjoy being close enough to ruin your peace without actually touching you. Whatever the reason, I know this. I wasn't alone out there. Not from the first night. Someone knew I was there. Someone watched. And someone walked that field each night, waiting. I haven't been back to the countryside since. And I never will. It had been about 11 months since Michelle passed. We weren't married anymore, hadn't been for over 6 years, but that didn't mean I didn't care. Our split had been quiet, mutual, and respectful. We just drifted. She moved back to Tennessee and I stayed up north in Illinois. We didn't talk much after the divorce. Maybe a birthday text once in a while, but nothing deep. Still, hearing she died in a crash outside of Murfreesboro hit harder than I expected. It sat with me like a heavy, damp towel over my shoulders for months. She had a small piece of land out near the Smoky Mountains, not too far from a quiet stretch of gravel roads and low pine ridges. We bought it together back in 2009. It was supposed to be a retirement cabin someday. After the divorce, she kept it. I never asked for my share. It didn't matter to me anymore. But after her funeral, her brother Darren called and said she left a few things behind in the cabin. Stuff with my name on it. Old boxes, journals, even an old .38 revolver I forgot I left there. I didn't want anything, but I figured going there might be a way to, close a loop. It was mid-November when I went. I drove my old silver Tacoma down from Joliet, slept in it the first night outside of Lexington, and reached the turnoff near Dandridge the next morning. The cabin wasn't even on GPS. I had to follow a hand-drawn map Michelle once mailed me back when she first stayed there. It was mostly just a square frame drawn in black pen and some arrows pointing to off-road path and the big black boulder. The place was up high. You had to leave the road after a tiny bridge that spanned a dry creek and then climb a steep, rutted path that twisted around between thick pine and hickory. Took me a while to get up there. The Tacoma's tires spun more than once, and I had to get out to kick away branches and small rocks. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky was already darkening. The cabin stood at the edge of the woods like it had been placed there by accident. It was small, just one room and a narrow deck with weather-worn planks. The tin roof was rusting, and the wood siding had gone from a light gray to something more like wet ash. But the place still looked solid. I parked, stretched my legs, and unlocked the door with the old key Darren had mailed. It creaked open with a sound that echoed more than it should have. Inside was cold, but not musty. She'd kept it clean. On the left was a cot with a green wool blanket folded tight. A small wood stove sat near the wall, a kettle still perched on it like someone would be back any minute. There was a small desk near the window, and I could already see the shoebox Darren had told me about. It had my name on it in thick black Sharpie. There was no power, just a single propane lamp hanging from a hook. I turned it on, and the glow filled the room with a soft orange warmth that barely reached the corners. The first few hours passed quiet. I didn't open the box yet. I sat, walked around, stepped out to look at the clearing. The trees had that late fall look, bare, stiff like dark fingers. The air was still.
No bugs, no birds.
Just that sharp smell of cold bark and damp dirt. By 7 o'clock, it was fully dark. I built a small fire in the stove using some stacked pine logs she left in a steel bin. The heat came slow but steady. I opened the shoebox finally. It was mostly papers, old photographs from our Colorado trip in 2007. A little green journal with my handwriting in it. A spare set of keys to a car I no longer owned. Then, tucked under the papers was the .38 revolver I thought I lost years ago. Felt weird holding it. I checked the chamber. Empty. I put it back and closed the box. There was no cell signal up there. My plan was to stay one night, sleep, wake up early, and leave. But somewhere around 10 p.m., as I lay on the cot under the blanket, I started to feel off. Not scared, just alert, like something didn't quite sit right. At first, I thought it was just the quiet. My ears were picking up every creak, every thump of a log settling in the stove. But then I heard something I couldn't explain away. A short, sharp knock. Not on the door, on the side of the cabin. 3 quick taps. I froze, sat up, waited. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a branch falling. Maybe an animal brushed the wall. I got up, walked over to the door, and opened it slowly. The clearing looked the same. Nothing moved. The cold bit into my skin. I walked around the side. My boots crunched dead leaves. Nothing. Then I turned and saw it. Just a few feet from the cabin wall, half sunk into the dirt, was a fresh footprint. Not mine. The tread was different. Deeper, too. Someone had walked there. Recently. Maybe an hour ago at most. I looked out toward the trees, squinting past the reach of the propane lamp's glow. Just darkness. Back inside, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, sat by the stove for a while, revolver on the table beside me. I felt stupid for feeling nervous. People hike up here all the time, right? But still, something kept scratching at my nerves. Not fear, more like dread slowly dripping. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Not a knock this time, a crunch, soft, like a footstep on frozen soil just outside the window. I didn't move. I just sat, staring at the door. A minute passed, then 5. Another sound, this one closer. This time, I stood and walked over to the window slowly. I didn't turn the light on. I stayed in the shadows, peeking out into the black. Then I saw a shape, not clear, just the outline of someone standing still near the trees, facing the cabin, not moving. I stayed frozen, my breath shallow. After maybe 20 seconds, the shape stepped back into the woods and disappeared. I waited another 10 minutes before moving. I grabbed the revolver and loaded it with the old ammo I found in the shoebox. Sat back on the cot with the gun in my lap. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I opened the door slowly, stepped outside. The shape was gone, but footprints were there. Multiple ones. Same tread pattern as the one I saw earlier. I circled the clearing, then walked about 20 yards into the trees. Nothing, but I found a broken branch that looked recent. Something had definitely been out there. I didn't wait around. Packed up the box, locked the cabin, and left. Back at the bottom of the ridge, I drove until I hit cell signal and called the county sheriff's office. Just told them I saw someone trespassing. They said they'd send someone to check. A week later, Darren called. He'd gone up there to get a few things too. The sheriff told him they found signs that someone had been squatting in the area. A fire pit in the woods about 50 yards east of the cabin. Empty cans.
Torn sleeping bag.
And something else. A length of rope nailed to a tree, tied in loops, like hand restraints. They didn't catch anyone. That was last year. I haven't gone back. Sometimes I still wonder if that person was watching Michelle while she stayed there. If she ever knew. If maybe the crash wasn't just a crash. But I can't prove anything. I just know that when I stood inside that cabin and felt something wrong, I wasn't imagining it. And whatever was out there that night wasn't just passing through. It was late October 2019, and I had taken some time off work after a tough couple of months at the machine shop. I was 32, single, and living in Evansville, Indiana. Life wasn't bad, just slow, and I felt like I needed to disconnect from everything for a while. I wanted quiet.
No phones.
No internet. No people. A buddy of mine had told me about this old hunting cabin his family used to use in the late 80s, way out near the edge of Shawnee National Forest, just across the border in southern Illinois. Said it hadn't been used in a long time but was still standing. He gave me directions scrawled on a ripped piece of cardboard. Told me I could use it as long as I packed in everything I needed and didn't mind being totally alone. Sounded like exactly what I wanted. I loaded up my Tacoma with some basic supplies. Canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, some tools, and an old Remington 870 just for peace of mind. I brought a couple paperback books, a small generator for charging a flashlight, and my phone, though I kept it off most of the time, and a gas lantern. It took me about 4 hours to drive out that way, then almost another hour bouncing down a nearly invisible dirt road barely wider than the truck. The GPS didn't register it at all. I only knew I was going the right way because I matched a few landmarks my buddy mentioned. An old split rail fence, a rotting billboard that said farmland for sale in fading red letters, and a rusted tractor half sunk into the ground. By the time I found the cabin, it was already getting late in the afternoon. It was smaller than I expected. Just a simple wooden structure, maybe 20 feet across, one room with a sagging tin roof and one tiny porch with a railing that looked like it would give out if you leaned too hard on it. The wood was gray with age, Moss had crept up the north side. One of the windows had a crack across it, but it was dry inside, and it didn't smell too bad once I opened the door and let it air out. There was an old metal bed frame in the corner with busted springs, a wood-burning stove in the middle, and a few shelves nailed up along the wall. I cleared out a few spiderwebs, laid out my sleeping bag, and got the stove working again after sweeping out the ashes. That night, I made some chili from a can, read a few pages from one of my books, and fell asleep to the sound of wind rattling the shutters. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I woke up when I felt like it, took short walks through the trees. There was a clearing about 200 yards behind the cabin with some old deer stands leaning against the tree trunks. I saw no sign of people, no distant cars.
No planes overhead.
Just silence, total peace. On the fourth day, I went a little farther out than usual. I was walking west, down a slope thick with fallen leaves, and found the edge of a large, open field I hadn't seen before. It looked out of place, too flat and cleared to be natural, like someone had worked this land a long time ago. I figured it was an old pasture or maybe used to be farmland. Grass grew waist-high in places. A few clusters of trees stood near the center. There were fence posts around the edge, long stripped of wire. I didn't see anything strange at first. I just stood at the tree line, looking out, wondering why someone would abandon a field this big. But then I noticed something, or someone, standing near the center of the field. It was far off, probably a couple hundred yards away. I couldn't make out details, just the dark shape of a man, not moving, just standing there. I froze. My first thought was another hiker, maybe a hunter, but I hadn't seen or heard a single soul in days, and I doubted anyone else would be walking this deep without a truck nearby. Still, I didn't panic. I watched for a while. The shape didn't move. I thought maybe it was a scarecrow or even a tree stump, but something about the posture looked too human. Arms low, shoulders square. I backed off slowly, returned to the cabin, and sat on the porch for a long time thinking about it. I wasn't scared, just unsettled. The woods didn't feel as empty anymore. I told myself it was probably just a hunter checking a stand or a surveyor doing some work. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. Every time I rolled over, I listened for footsteps outside. The next morning, I went back. I figured I'd get closer, see what it really was, maybe ease my nerves. But when I got to the edge of the field, there was nothing there. No man.
No scarecrow. No stump.
Just grass blowing in the breeze. That should have calmed me down, but it didn't. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the grass for flattened patches or boot prints. I didn't find anything. I kept feeling like someone was watching me from the trees, but every time I looked, I saw nothing. That night, I heard something outside. It was well after midnight. The wind had died down and everything was dead quiet. Then I heard what sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, on dry leaves. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. The sound stopped. I waited. Then came the creak of the front porch. It was faint but real, just one groan of old wood under weight. I reached for the Remington, eased off the safety, and waited. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loud. I just sat in the dark, watching the thin strip of moonlight coming through the cracked window. Nothing happened.
No knock.
No sound of a hand on the doorknob. Just silence again. I sat there until first light. When I finally got the nerve to open the door, there was nothing on the porch. No tracks. No signs. But that board had creaked. I knew the sound. I thought about leaving. Part of me wanted to just pack up and go home. But I also didn't want to be the kind of person who got scared by a little noise in the woods. I told myself it could have been a deer stepping onto the porch. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe I imagined it. But the next night it happened again. Same sound. Same hour. First the leaves, then the creak of the porch. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed with my back against the wall, shotgun in hand, waiting. Again, nothing followed.
Nonak.
No voice, no movement. This time I was sure it wasn't an animal. Too heavy, too slow. The pattern of the steps was human. In the morning, I circled the cabin looking for tracks. The ground was damp from dew, and near the back corner of the cabin, I found a partial print in the mud. Not a boot, a bare foot. The heel and ball were clear. Whoever it was had been walking without shoes. That pushed me over the edge. I decided to leave. I packed everything up as fast as I could, tossing it into the bed of the truck without bothering to organize it. I shut the cabin door and didn't look back. The dirt road out was rougher than I remembered. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches. The second time, I noticed something strange. Off to the side of the road, in the trees maybe 20 yards deep, was a patch of disturbed earth. Like something had been dug up and refilled. It was about 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, fresh. I didn't go check. I didn't want to know. I got back in the truck and drove without stopping. When I finally got back to town, I told my buddy not to mention the cabin to anyone else. I didn't explain why. I didn't want to talk about it. I just told him it wasn't a good place anymore. Weeks passed. I tried to forget it. I kept telling myself I imagined parts of it. That stress and isolation had played tricks on me. But a month later, my buddy called me. Said someone had found that cabin. Said a hiker had wandered off a trail and stumbled across it. The police had gotten involved because of what he saw in the field behind it. They found more of those patches. 3 of them, all fresh, all shaped like graves. The police never released anything official, but word got around that one of the patches wasn't empty. I didn't ask what they found inside. I didn't want to know. I don't go into the woods alone anymore, and I never stay in cabins that I don't know the full history of. Something was out there, not a ghost, not a monster, just a person, maybe a drifter, maybe someone living feral, maybe something worse, but they were real. They watched me. They came to the porch. They were barefoot, and they were burying something in that field, and I'll never go back.